Today on the John Ankerberg Show, people look at world events and increasingly are asking the question, how much longer can we go on this way? Are we close to the end? North Korea threatens to strike America with a hydrogen bomb. Iran is building a nuclear bomb to wipe out Israel. Russia is exerting its power in the Middle East. And Europe faces terrorism attacks from within. The God of the Bible speaks of events that will happen in the last days. How do the nations and events we are seeing today relate to what the Bible says will happen? My guest today is news journalist Dr. Jimmy DeYoung, who has reported from Jerusalem since 1991. He has interviewed every Israeli prime minister over the last 25 years. We invite you to join us. Welcome to our program. I'm John Ankerberg. Thank you for joining me today. We have a wonderful guest. His name is Dr. Jimmy DeYoung. He's a journalist who's been covering Israel since 1991, has known all the prime ministers, interviewed them, and he's also a prophecy scholar. And Jimmy, today we want to talk about Israel, all right? You have covered Israel for all of these years, and we have been talking in the past weeks about this nation. And one of the facts that everybody should have in mind is that the Bible, the very prophetic words that we're looking at in the Old Testament, for 2,000 years said that Israel would someday become a nation. And they said this when Israel was not a nation, okay? But in our lifetime, in 1948, Israel became a nation. Now talk about a little bit about the background of this great, amazing fact of prophecy.
That prophecy I believe you're referring to could be found in the book of Ezekiel. In fact, it's not only talking about the nation coming into existence. We're talking about the 37th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones, the bones coming together, the regathering of the Jewish people from all over the world. And then the flesh on the bones, that's the restoration of a Jewish state. And in 2018, the nation of Israel celebrates its 70th anniversary or 70th birthday. But when you go back in Ezekiel to chapter 34, 18 times the Lord says, I'm going to do this. He said, I'm going to find my people wherever they have been scattered. I will gather them into the land I gave their forefathers. I will feed them like a good shepherd feeds his flock. Now we see tangible evidence of how that has taken place. In chapter 36, he talks about the land. 36 times he says, this is the land, this is the piece of real estate that I'm going to give my people, the Jewish people. And what's interesting about that, 38 passages deal with all the biblical borders of Israel. And what they have today is only 10%. What they have been promised is unbelievable if you ever understand how that all comes about. But chapter 36 has a wonderful verse there, and it says, the Lord says, hey folks, I don't do this for you, Israel, or for you, Judah. I do it for my holy name's sake. Because when I could swear by nothing greater, I swore that I would bring my people back into existence, put them in their land, and have a program for them throughout eternity. That's what he's done.
Yeah, in fact, the events that we're going to talk about still coming up here, along with the facts about Israel becoming a nation, how many times did God conclude with the words, when I do this, Israel, the nations will know that I am the Lord? How many times did he say that?
72 times in the book of Ezekiel, he made that statement.
Yeah, I was reading it for devotions the other night, and that just popped out at me, and I stared at that verse. They will know that I am the Lord. So fact number one is Israel is back in the land, and they are a nation. Now, the same prophet that prophesied that also said that when they get there, there's going to be a coalition of nations that's going to come against them, all right, and try to destroy them. And he named names. He identified the nations that were going to come. Which nations did he identify?
Well, in chapter 38, I talked about chapters 34 to 37. Chapter 38, when they're in the land. And in fact, it says in chapter 38, verse 8, when they're dwelling safely in that land. And verse 11, it's a military terminology, when they are living in unwalled villages. That means they've laid down their defensive system, their military defense to protect themselves. If you look at our pillars over here, you'll see and recognize the three main events in the future. As you look at the screen, you'll see on your left, that first pillar represents the rapture of the church, the next main event in God's calendar of activities, and absolutely nothing has to happen before that rapture does take place. And then there's a space between the rapture and that second pillar, which is the return of Jesus Christ. That space in between would be referred to as the tribulation period. And that is the time period when this coalition of nations will come together. And John, we've been talking on the last several programs about Ezekiel 38, where it mentions Russia, Turkey, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and then the other passages in Psalm 83 and in Daniel 11 talks about Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. Those are the players that are going to come against the Jewish state soon after the rapture of the church.
Yeah, and what are the things that are kind of pulling them together to form this coalition? What do they have in common?
They have in common, the lowest common denominator, is they're all Islamic. Now, we mentioned Russia. That nation is not an Islamic nation as such, but the fastest growing religion, as I've already mentioned before, is Islamic faith in that land, among many in the military, for example. There are major players in the military that have converted to Islam. And so that's one of the commonalities that they have with each other. But in addition to that, the relationship that Vladimir Putin, leader of Russia, has been developing among all of these nations that we've mentioned. He's given opportunity, for example, Iran, to have a nuclear weapon of mass destruction. Russia gave them the technology, the technicians to do that. He's going into the other nations that we mentioned, many of them putting up a nuclear reactor so they can have energy in those locations. He's developing ways to come together. He's selling military arms to them. And what's so amazing to me is that look at Syria today. As we study this scenario, the first nation to make a move against the Jewish state is going to be Syria. And Syria today is occupied basically by Russia. Russia has a naval base on the Mediterranean coast, several military bases. One of them has just been built 5 miles from the Israeli border. And there they have joining them the Revolutionary Guard from Iran, also coming from Lebanon over there across the northern border of Israel into this location 5 miles away from the border itself there in the Golden Heights. You have Hezbollah, the terror organization, the surrogate terrorist organization for Iran. You have other players from these other nations coming in there. The Muslim Brotherhood has a group of terrorists in that location endeavoring to form that coalition. And they're right this minute, John, at the northern border of Israel.
Yeah, and Trump and Putin, when they met together, created a safe zone. And who was given charge of that safe zone?
Russia was given charge of it. And in fact, boy, I've got to tell you, Prime Minister Netanyahu is very much concerned about that, because the Israeli military forces, their aircraft, their military air force, has had to fly in and take out some of the convoys that are moving munitions into that area 5 miles from their border. At the same time, Syria has used chemical weapons of mass destruction. They've been transferring them over to southern Lebanon and Hezbollah. They had to take out some of those convoys. Israel needs to have the right to go in when they think they should go in to protect their nation. But this safe zone operation that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump put together, this is putting a quietus on that. They're going to have to do something else to figure out how to get in there.
All right, folks, I would just advise you that when you're listening to the news at night, that you hear these countries, because these countries are in the news almost every day now, okay? That when you do, that you bring them back into the prophetic scenario. And Jimmy, let's bring them back into your pillars. When is this war, this coalition of nations, actually going to get their act together and come into and try to invade Israel?
John, in the first 6 months, you see the rapture on your left of the screen, and then you have the tribulation, and then you have the return. In that first 6 months of that tribulation period, and let me tell you why I make that statement, is because Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27 says that the Antichrist will confirm a covenant, a treaty with many. And it's talking about Israel and all the people that we have mentioned in these telecasts, the Ezekiel 38 coalition. That this Antichrist confirms a peace agreement with them, which actually starts the clock ticking on that 7-year period of time. And so they have to move into their positions to wipe out the Jewish state of Israel in that first 6-month period. And the reason I make that statement, where's the Antichrist supposed to be in that first half of the tribulation period? He's supposed to be over in Rome, Italy. Revelation chapter 17, developing a false religiosity. Chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, and in verse 41 it says he rushes back in when this coalition starts, when Syria makes its first move to take the Golan Heights back. And by the way, that's exactly what Bashar Assad has been saying. I'm going to take the Golan Heights back. I'll take it politically or I'll take it militarily. He's ready. And he made an interesting statement the other day. He said, you can even wipe out Damascus, destroy Damascus. I'm still going to go in there. Wait a minute. Oh, that's Isaiah chapter 17. 5 times it says Damascus will be destroyed. That happens in the first 6 months of the tribulation period.
Yeah. We're talking about how close are we to the end according to biblical prophecy, all right? And we're talking about the events that are happening in Israel. And we've been talking about this Ezekiel 38 war, coalition of nations that are going to come against Israel. Let's get to the bottom line. What happens when the coalition does come against Israel? What does God say in Ezekiel 38 and 39?
In chapter 38, starting in verse 18 through chapter 39, verse 6, the Lord says, when this happens, I'm going to take care of my people. I will supernaturally intercede to wipe out this coalition of nations. And by the way, remember I was talking about the fact that the Antichrist confirms a peace treaty, and I then said that the Ezekiel 38 war is going to take place in the first 6 months. Well, God has a plan for Rome, and that is a false religion. And Islam will not cooperate with a false religion. You're either a Muslim or you're a dead person at this time in history. And so the fact is that they have to be. Islam has to be out of the way. That takes out Islam all the way across the world and renders them inoperative, so the Lord's plan will continue to unfold. Now that's going to take place in that first 6 months of the tribulation period, and thus we see how God is working to set that all in place.
All right, now to talk about other events that might say how close are we to the end, let's talk about what's happened in the news, all right? We've had President Trump in the first part of his 6 to 8 month term of presidency. He has made a trip to Saudi Arabia. He had 51 representative countries of the Arab League there, and he gave a speech. Then he came to Israel and he talked with Benjamin Netanyahu. He also went to the Palestinians and talked with Mahmoud Abbas. And then he went and he talked with the Pope. What I want to know as far as Israel is concerned is what did they think about his trip and what he said to the Arab League and how close he got to them.
You might remember that the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Barack Obama was terrible. It was a very bad situation, and the Israelis were much concerned about that. And so when Donald Trump invited Netanyahu to visit the White House, and Donald Trump and his wife came to meet them, and they had the media there, and there was Netanyahu with his wife, and they had a marvelous meeting together. That was key. And at that point in time, the Israelis were very pleased. They are excited about the fact that now there's going to be that proper relationship between the only democracy in the Middle East, that's Israel, and the United States, which is the major supporter of Israel as it relates to all the nations of the world. So that was fine. But then when President Trump announced that he was coming to the Middle East, this was his first foreign trip. He was coming to the Middle East, and where did he choose to stop first? Saudi Arabia. That is the headquarters for the Islamic world. the two most important cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. That's the location where they are. The people of the Islamic world look to Saudi Arabia as the leaders. And then you have the Wahhabi terrorists. That is an Islamic element, the probably most fierce Islamic radicals in the world. They are the ones stationed in Saudi Arabia. You bring the 51 countries in, and President Trump goes and meets and talks with them. One of the things that I noticed, maybe you didn't notice this, they said at that meeting, we want to put together a NATO of the Islamic world. That is talking about the coalition that we've been discussing from Ezekiel chapter 38, John. So that happened. Now, Netanyahu and the leaders of Israel watching what took place there. And so they started to be a bit concerned. The president comes in to Jerusalem. Now remember, the president throughout all of his campaigning said, I am going to be the first president of the United States to move the United States Embassy into the capital of the Jewish state of Israel, Jerusalem.
Yeah, and I'm going to give you two statements. Trump, when he was there, said, Jerusalem is a sacred city. Its beauty, splendor, and heritage are like no other place on earth. The ties of the Jewish people to this holy land are ancient and eternal, and I make this promise to you, my administration will always stand with Israel. All right? And then he made these statements, we're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. What's happened?
Well, what's happened? That's the big question. That's what the Israeli leadership is so much concerned about. In fact, the Trump administration actually sent forth the vice president to make this statement, a confirmation that that move was going to take place. He said, it's not a question of if we're going to do that, but when we're going to do that. Well, the Israelis are watching that very closely because they now see he goes to the Islamic world first. He then doesn't follow through with one of his campaign promises. And from there, he goes to the Pope, who is almost totally anti-Israel in every statement that he makes, and some of the actions he takes as well. So the Israelis are very much concerned. They like Donald Trump, but they're very much concerned about, is he going to stay true to what he has promised?
All right, he met with Netanyahu, he met with the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, and they're trying to form this peace agreement, okay? Now, Netanyahu talked favorably about this, but most people don't realize what Mahmoud Abbas said about this peace negotiation. What did he say?
Well, he said that we're willing to go ahead with the peace, but let me tell you this, it's going to be a state that Palestine, which is the state he is calling for, which, by the way, has never been a Palestinian state in the Middle East in all of history. He wants the state of Palestine, he wants the capital of it as the city of Jerusalem, and he wants the borders to go back to the 67 borders before the Six-Day War, and Israel was able to get so much of that, what is referred to as the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, under their control. And that's debated territories. People say it's occupied territories. No, it's debated territories.
They forget that they were invaded, and that's why they got the territory.
Of course, in war. If you're going to use the principle, how about getting rid of Texas and California? They were invaded, and we just took them because we needed to have the security in those borders there. But the Israelis are ready to go to the negotiating table. Mahmoud Abbas is not yet ready to say he's going to recognize the Jewish state of Israel. And that's in the craw of the Jewish people. They say, look, if you can't even admit that we should have a right to exist as a state in the Middle East, what's the use of going to the table and trying to negotiate it? And if you're going to put all these preconditions in place, i.e. the 67 borders, the city of Jerusalem as at least a part of it is our capital for our state called Palestine, what's the use of even going to the table? I have to say, and I've talked to many of the leaders, I've heard the people in the street say, look, 81% of the Israelis say, we don't want a two-state solution. We want one state, it's going to be Israel, and we'll just work out some way the Palestinians can live.
All right, the most controversial piece of real estate in the world is the Temple Mount. And where do things stand in terms of the Temple Mount right now? Most people don't realize that when Israel captured the old city and the Temple Mount itself, that then, as a peace gesture, they gave it back, the Temple Mount control, to Jordan. And what did Jordan do? And tell us what the history is here.
Well, Jordan put up to be custodians of this piece of real estate, the Temple Mount, the Islamic Trust, or the Waqf, W-A-Q-F. And that is a group of Islamic leaders, basically Jordanians and some Palestinians, that make the decisions. When can the Jews or anybody else go up onto the Temple Mount? What they can do when they're up there, how long they can stay, when they have to come off. And so they've been controlling the Temple Mount. Now, a couple of months back, there was a major terrorist attack. There were 3 Israeli Arabs, and that means those are not necessarily Palestinians, but they are Israeli Arabs. In 1948, there were a group of Arabs that wanted to wipe out Israel, and they sent their families over to Jordan on the other side of the Jordan River. But there were some Arabs who wanted to stay there, so they got citizenship. They don't serve in the military, but they got citizenship. There's not as much security against the Israeli Arabs as it is against the Palestinians. They were able to go up onto the Temple Mount, get weapons, go off of the Temple Mount down to the Lion's Gate, kill 2 of the border policemen down there, then run from the Lion's Gate back up onto the Temple Mount, and a gunfight took place there, and those 3 Israeli Arab terrorists were killed on the Temple Mount. Immediately, the Israeli government said, we have to secure this piece of real estate. Though we have given custodial responsibility to Jordan and to the Palestinians and to the Islamic Trust, we are responsible for the security of it. We have sovereignty over the Temple Mount. So they put up metal detectors, first of all, and then the second thing they did, put up cameras. Well, the Muslims said, we're not going up onto the Temple Mount. Pressure came in from Saudi Arabia, from the United States, from the European Union. You've got to loosen up. Take those metal detectors down, take the cameras down. They did. And the reason this was all taking place is the Islamic world wanted to show who had the power and the control of the Temple Mount. That's why they rejected those metal detectors and the cameras. Hey, when they go to Mecca, they have to go through a metal detector to get in to do the Hajj. They're not afraid of metal detectors. They were trying to say who controls the Temple Mount. And that is key in understanding Bible prophecy.
All right, so all of these problems exist right now, and it's heading toward the fact of where?
Well, the fact is that the Islamic world is going to attack the Jewish state of Israel. They're going to try to wipe them out. They will be wiped out instead, that in the first 6 months of the tribulation period. But that's not going to be the end of wars and rumors of wars, as Jesus Christ said. That's going to continue all the way to the end of the tribulation period. And at that time, the other nations of the world, not the Gog-Magog coalition of nations, but the other nations of the world are going to come together and go towards Jerusalem to wipe out the Jewish state.
Yeah, and so we're going to take that up next week, okay? And it includes America, and we're going to talk about the European Union, and we may lead off with the question of the fact that we have a nuclear deal with Iran, and the clock is ticking. There's 8 years left on it, or pretty soon just 7 years left on it, and then they'll have the ability to create a nuclear bomb, all right? Netanyahu says it ain't going to happen. President Trump says it ain't going to happen. I want to know why it's not going to happen. I want you to tell me what they're saying in Israel they're going to do about it, if that does come about. So all of that, plus I want to talk about the European Union, and I want to talk about America as well, all in next week's program. I hope that you join us. Well, thanks for being with me today. If you'd like to have our 2 new series with Dr. Jimmy DeYoung, in which he talks about the nations Ezekiel predicts will come against Israel in the latter days, I believe that once you learn what God predicts will happen up ahead, from that point on, you're going to always view world news through the lens of this biblical prophecy. Our new series, The Headlines of the End Times, explains in detail Ezekiel's prophecy in chapter 38. Which nations does God predict will come against Israel? Which powerful nation will lead this coalition? And are there strong ties between these nations today? Do some of these nations openly boast that they will destroy the state of Israel? What world events does the Bible predict will happen before the Ezekiel 38 war happens? Well, all of these questions and more are answered in our series, The Headlines of the End Times. And the 3 programs in this series are available for a gift of only $39. Then we taped a second series with Dr. Jimmy DeYoung entitled, How Close is the End?, in which he identifies the remaining nations the prophet Ezekiel predicts will come against Israel in the latter days. And how does God protect Israel when these nations attack? The 3 programs in this series are also available for a gift of $39. And then third, we're making available the biblical case for the rapture of all Christians. This is a series I taped with prophecy scholars Dr. Ed Heinzen, Dr. Mark Hitchcock, and Dr. Ron Rhodes. In this important series, they examine and explain every rapture passage in the Bible. And all 3 of their programs are available for a gift of $49. Then fourth, we are also making available a series we taped with these men entitled 5 Great Debates of the End Times. Here they answer questions Christians debate today, such as, will the Antichrist be a Muslim, a Gentile, or a Jew? And what about replacement theology? Has the church really replaced Israel as the recipient of God's promises and blessings? Will the Jewish temple be rebuilt on the Temple Mount before Jesus returns? What nations are involved in the Battle of Armageddon? The 3 programs in this series, the 5 Great Debates of the End Times, are also available for a gift of $49. And finally, if you'd like to have all 4 of these series together, containing 12 television programs, plus 2 important study guides, we're making them available in a special package for a gift of only $99. You may order this special package now by calling us at 1-800-805-3030. That's 1-800-805-3030. And you may call that same number any day this week, 24 hours a day. Or if you wish, you may order this special package at our website at jashow.org right now, where we have a secure place for you to give your gift.